Mae festival ma yr ysgolgen. Tablau some here in the Thank you all for attending. It's really great to see so many new faces coming tonight, especially, well, it's not a bad night. I had written down in my head, a cold and dark November night. Well, it's cold and dark, but it's nice. It's beautiful. And as some of you read in the October issue of Lochatua News, I forgot to welcome Ian. I'll start again. I'd like to welcome Ian Quigley, who's come to speak to us on his extensive research of the village of Vatisker. And I'd like to thank you, Ian, for making a long journey from West Lothian to be with us tonight. And as some of you will have read in the November issue of Lochatua News, Ian was motivated to start his research on Vatisker when he started looking into the life of his grandfather, William MacDonald, who was born and brought up in Vatisker. And then, as Ian said in the article in Lochatua News, the whole thing grew arms and legs, as I'm sure you'll all find out tonight. Ian has been a great supporter of Comann Eachdraidh. When we first put a little notice in Lochatua News in, I think, March 2017, and then we had inviting people to come, and then in the July, I think, was it July? People gathered, and Ian came all the way from West Lothian to join us at that very first meeting, which I think shows just how interested he is in his own heritage. He, in fact, has represented the Comann Eachdraidh at various heritage events in Edinburgh, because it's very handy for him to go there. And on a personal note, on meeting Ian first on that first evening, through in the wee room in this building, in conversation, I asked Ian, where in Vatisker did your family come from? And he replied, 3 Vatisker. And I said, oh, that's funny. My granny came from 3 Vatisker, my father's mother. And Ian's family, the 3 Vatisker was divided into 3A Vatisker and 3B Vatisker, and Ian's family were in 3A Vatisker, ours were in 3B Vatisker, and Ian worked out that, let me get it right, William McRae and Mary MacLeod, 3 Vatisker, were Ian's 3rd great grandparents. That means they were his great grandparents, and they were my 2nd great grandparents, my great grandparents. How coincidental is that? So it just shows you that people with a name like Quigley and Tucker really have good Vatisker credentials. And I'm delighted to welcome Ian here tonight, and also delighted that so many people have come to support Ian, especially him having made such a long journey. We discussed this earlier, and Ian was saying, rather than having a question and answer session after this talk, he's happy to talk to people and chat with you when we have a cup of tea afterwards, informally. So, with no further ado, Ian, on we go. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. This is the first time really I've did this kind of thing, so if you don't hear me at the back, just let me know. Thank you for coming along. It's an honour to follow in the footsteps of people who have presented previously, who are professional historians and accomplished writers, unlike myself. So people like Joni Buchanan and Bill Lawson, people that I really admire. So it is a bit daunting to follow in the footsteps of these people, but hopefully I'll do okay. It's great to see family and friends here this evening as well, and I'm very grateful to Historical Society for giving me the opportunity to do this presentation this evening. One sort of caveat just before I say anything: this is very much work in progress. I've been at it for almost 11 years, but it's still work in progress. So just bear that in mind. That eventually, when hopefully I do publish some stuff in this, it may look slightly different to what you're seeing tonight, but this is my current understanding of what I've learned. So just a couple of things I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk a bit about the project, and I'm sure a lot of people probably thinking, well, why? why is this guy from the Lowlands interested? So we're going to talk a bit about that, and a bit about how it's come about and some of the challenges that I've faced in the project. I'm also going to talk through a bit of a whistle-stop tour of just a bit about the history of Lewis and a bit about the history of the village itself. And kind of along certain topics, so more around the development of the village, a bit about health, and touching migration as well, a touch. And then sort of finish off with just a bit of a plea for help, because what you'll see is, as I say, the culmination of 11 years of research, but it has been very factually based. It's looking at historical records. I would like to try and bring that to life if possible, and I've got a few ideas as to how we can do that. So hopefully you guys can help me do that. So why have I done this? So you will have noticed my accent's not local, and I don't think there's many Quigleys in Lewis. In fact, I don't think there's any. Colin was looking it up in the phone book earlier, and there's one in the whole of the Highlands, I think. Is that right? So the obvious question is why, and I guess the reason why is the gentleman on the screen there. He's my grandfather, and as Anna said, he was born and raised in Vatisker. And I guess at the end of the 1980s, I became sort of interested in a group you might have heard of called Runrig, and I found them very inspirational in terms of I wanted to find out a bit more about my Lewis ancestry, and in 1991 was my first visit to Lewis, and I'm sure Morag and Christina will fondly remember 18 of us descending on Vatisker that year. But it genuinely was a fantastic holiday, and really hooked me on Lewis, and I've returned many times since. The one thing that I always think about when I think back to that first time is a thought I had in my head, which was how fortunate my ancestors were to live in such a beautiful place. And absolutely, they were fortunate to live in a beautiful place. But I think it was maybe a wee bit naive, and from what I've learned since, life certainly wasn't as idyllic as the physical landscape might have suggested. But our ancestors were incredible people. They had to battle, some of them battled their whole life against forces that they couldn't control. And I think a word that's often used is oppression, and I think that's probably correct if you think about back in those days. However, we persist today because of their determination and their hard work. And I'm going to be just a wee bit philosophical, so forgive me, but it is all to sort of to understand why I'm doing this. In my head, life is the greatest gift that's sort of passed from generation to generation, and the there's a song that Runrig did called "The Story," which they released about 3 years ago, and really, for me, those lyrics kind of sum it up. Particularly the last couple of lines, can't help feeling it'll always be the story of the life inside of me, because I firmly believe that we're not just here because of our own experiences, but the experiences of those who've kind of gone before us as well. So I firmly believe that part of my story is their story, and part of our story, because I'm assuming that a lot of people have got ancestors from Vatisker. I first searched my grandfather's birth. I was looking it up the other day, January 2009, so it is almost 11 years ago. And as Anna said, it kind of grew arms and legs, and it's been a kind of labour of love, I guess. And this place became my second home, really. Spent days on end, Register House in Edinburgh, also at the National Library, and a couple of days even in Stornoway Library, researching, and together with sort of endless hours writing down what I found. Over the years, been a growing sort of body of material, but when I kind of started out 10 years ago, there wasn't much information about this area, really. But as time rolls on, there's been more publications, and just to give an idea of the kind of records that I've been looking at, births, deaths, marriages, census records, valuation rolls, national archives, newspapers, government papers, immigration papers. The list kind of is endless. But there's really three aspects to what I've been doing. One is historical context, which what is going on in Lewis and the wider world when our ancestors were around. The other is Croft Diaries. So I have researched every single person that's been on a census record in Vatisker without fail. I've researched everybody. I'm not saying I've got all the details, because a lot of times it's not easy to find, and obviously been doing some data analysis, and I'll share some of that with you in a second. So there's been a lot of stuff and a lot of challenges, and I think we touched on it a bit earlier about some of the challenges. For example, names. There's 29 Donald MacLeods in my research, and as mentioned, sadly counted 427 times in my notes, and there is 18 Catherine MacLeods. So that's a big challenge when you're kind of doing this kind of research, but all good. And name changes was another thing that we mentioned earlier. When people start off life as one name and then change it, but not officially, and call themselves something else, and end their life a different name, that can be very challenging. Also, some of the records that I've researched in terms of completeness and accuracy, they've got better over time. One of the big challenges is in the early years there was no Croft numbers on any of the records, so again, you're faced with a census of 15 pages. You've got to try and work out where those people sort of fit into the village. So again, that can be really challenging, but also I sadly find it quite interesting. The census records as well, for anyone who's done any sort of research, there was a time where ages were rounded. So rounded, I think it was, I can't remember if it was up or down, to the nearest 5 years. So that can be very confusing when you're, researching people. And also, I think generally, back in the sort of early days, people didn't know their age. They didn't have to know. So there was that as well. So you would find that some people would be, 15 in one census, and they'd be 28 in the next census and stuff like that. So those are all quite sort of kind of tough challenges. So that was just a bit of a flavour of what I've been doing and some of the challenges. I'd kind of like to just go through some of the sort of research I've done. And sorry for all the words, but I'll talk through this. But I'll kind of start, so most of the official records start from about 1840s, but I'll kind of go back a bit further and just give a bit of context. So Vatisker is Norse origin, so that does sort of suggest that there was a settlement here centuries ago. The first time in official records, 1718, and just to sort of paint a picture of what life was like back in the sort of 18th century, there was a publication called the Description of Western Islands of Scotland by a chap called Martin. He described scarcity, industrious people, and interestingly, the people were healthy. And I think partly due to up until about 1700, the people of Lewis were pretty self-sufficient. There wasn't the communication to the wider world, or even within Lewis itself. So I think that probably helped in terms of spreading disease and stuff like that. I've kind of mentioned here 1750 to 1780, because that was really when fishing started to sort of take prominence. So after the Jacobite Rebellion in 1745, people were expected to pay their rents in money as opposed to in kind, and they had to find ways of making money, and fishing was the one way that they could do that. So that became quite prominent around that time, and this might seem a bit random, but it's kind of, I guess, just important things that happened during that period. So 1765, for example, the New Testament, they started to translate it to Gaelic, and that was completed a couple of years later, and that was really fundamental in terms of the development of education. There's further evidence sort of late in the 18th century. Again, people are healthy, and you'll see that as we go through this, that's not kind of always been the case. There's been periods of illness. So around about the early 1800s, the Mackenzie estate was really dependent on three things really: the fishing, the cattle, and the kelp. And right about the early 1800s, demand for kelp reduced, the prices for cattle reduced, and the result was that the estate fell into heavy debt. And there was a document in 1811 that talked about Back had about 700 people at that time, and there was only 6 who were literate in English and two who were literate in Gaelic at that time. So, however, 1811, that all started to change. The Gaelic school at Back was established, and obviously that began to change, and you'll see that as we go through. 1815, Lord Seaforth died, and his estate passed to his daughter. So Vatisker in particular then, so in 1829, I guess Vatisker as a crofting community was started. 29 crofts, and the first rental was 1830. 1840 there was another croft added, so we moved up to 30, and you'll see there, I've just sort of mentioned a couple of bits about the population. So the population in general in Lewis was rising quite dramatically. You'll see there almost a 40% rise in 20 years. from 1811 to 1831. And the first population of Vatisker that's mentioned is 1835, and there was 208 people in the village. So the principal complaints around the time, documented complaints, were around high rents and short leases, and of course we all know that took quite a long time to actually resolve. Fishing obviously was the principal employment, and 1835-36 there was some pretty poor weather that resulted in the failure of the potato crop, and also cattle prices dropped, and the result was a lot of poverty. I've kind of included here a bit about back school. So 1837 there was a document that gives us a bit of an insight into the school. So you can see already things starting to change. There's 109 pupils. The books used were the New Testament and Bible. Interestingly, well, I thought it was interesting, there was no lessons in agriculture, and I think that sort of underlined the attitude at that stage around crofting, and what people thought about that, because you would have thought in a crofting community there would be lessons in agriculture, and there wasn't. So 1841 census was the first census that documented individuals' details, and I've just put some comparisons really. At that time the population was 211, the average household had just under 6 people, and it was a very young community at that point. The average age was under 23, so very young. The number of crofts was still 30, but there was an increase in the number of houses. So there was 36 houses across 30 crofts. And you'll see again, this is a common theme, the rise in the population of Lewis, plus 17% since the last census. There's an interesting stat there about since 1811, the Lewis population had increased by 69%, so quite a huge jump in terms of population, and obviously there was pressure on the economy as a result. 1843 the Free Church was established, and obviously that would become a key part in the community, not just from a spiritual sense but also from an educational perspective as well. And I thought it was interesting that in 1843 there was an inquiry into the poor law system, and I just thought I would mention, because it sort of gives an insight into how people thought of the community, I guess, at that stage. So the townships and the crofters looked after each other, they looked after their own poor people, and it was an interesting thing to say that when the children married, the parents sort of, I guess, gave up what they had to them, and then in return they would be looked after. So again, you can see a very close community and close bonding in the community. Yes, the other big things in that period, James Matheson bought the island, and in 1845 the poor law came into force. The potato crop, so 1846 there was what we call potato blight. The potato became a staple of the diet, and when so potato blight was like a fungal disease of the potatoes, and when that happened, obviously it resulted in great sort of stress in the community, and that really persisted for the remainder of that decade. And with so many things that you'll see, the solution was thought to be emigration. And on one hand, James Matheson was offering free transport to the lowlands for people who wanted to find work there. He employed people in road making, etc. And he also offered to pay the passage of people if they wanted to emigrate to Canada as well. So we know that there were a number of emigrations from Stornoway in that period. There was, I think, 3 that were mentioned in official documents, which was 1,600 people between 1841 and 1846. So we know that those sort of schemes had sort of taken effect. We also know that as a result of the sort of economy at that time, that from a population of just under 20,000, there was 12,800 people in receipt of charity at that point. But the good thing was that just around the corner, in the early 1850s, the Caithness fisheries started to expand, and the sort of local fishermen would go away for 6 weeks. They would do their work at Caithness and come back with much needed cash to pay their rents. Interestingly, from some of the documentation that I've read, immigration at that time was still very high on the agenda, but it didn't seem so high on the agenda for the villages around Broad Bay, and I think that was predominantly because they could make money from the fishing, so there wasn't such a big need for emigration, so there was no hard sell. And I think there was a very interesting book by John Monroe Mackenzie, who was a Chamberlain of Lewis at that point in time, and I put a quote there that he met the people of Coll, Vatisker and back, and found no one willing to emigrate. The greater part of the first 2 townships, Coll and Vatisker, were pretty clear of arrears, and back were due to Mr McKeever, who's Lewis McKeever, the factor of Gress. So I thought it was an interesting quote. Not very often you get sort of quotes that mention Vatisker specifically, and it was nice to see just a bit of a note of interest, I guess, on what was going on at that time. So moving sort of swiftly on to 1851, I realise we're kind of motoring through the decades here, but there was 10 crofts added in 1851 and a further 6 in 1858. And you'll see a rent change there of plus 5%, but that was just the additional crofts that resulted in that. And interestingly, at the bottom, the first time really been able to compare the population of Vatisker between 2 censuses, and you see there that the population of the village increased at a much higher rate than the population of Lewis as a whole. So, the population of Vatisker was increasing at a higher, above average rate for Lewis. Just a few interesting stats from the census. There was just under 6 residents per house at that time, so that was about the average. And the most people in one house was 10, and there was a further 4 who had 9 people. So it just gives a bit of an indication of the size of families and stuff at that time. As you can see there, the vast majority of residents were actually born in Vatisker. So 1851 was the first time it was really quite explicit about where people were born. So the vast majority were born there. Just another quote from John Monroe Mackenzie from 1851, which I felt a wee bit of pride, to be honest, when I read the Vatisker people are better payers and can retain their farm at a higher rent than one man could. So clearly it was more profitable to sort of let out the crofts to individuals as opposed to letting out to a taxman. And again, you'll see the emigration is sort of big on the agenda again. 1851, there was 800 people left Lewis, and a lot of them ended in Australia. A couple of other big things for that particular decade. There was a system called summing that was introduced, where again, for me anyway, it kind of once again shows the controlling aspect of the landlord, really, and that, you know, they would decide how much livestock you could have on your croft, and that was it. You know, it wasn't up to you; it was up to them, kind of thing. And then another interesting thing, 1859, the Royal Naval Reserve was established, and it would be a good few years later before the Stornoway operation started. But I thought it was an interesting stat that by 1914, a tenth of the Royal Naval Reserve were from Lewis. So. Do a bit of data analysis, I guess, on deaths, and it really is just for me, it just gives a view on health, really. And at this point in time, 1855 was the point where it became mandatory to start registering births, deaths, marriages. And it was obviously very early in that process. You'll see a lot of unknowns there for a number of reasons, really. Not the least of which was there'd be no medical attendant, so they didn't actually know what the cause of death was. But I mean, I guess there is a sort of common theme that you'll see. Consumption and dropsy were the sort of two top diseases around at that point. But having said that, you'll see the average age as well was really low. The average age of people when they died. But again, just remember that the community at that stage was very young. You know, there was less sort of older people around. Around about 1861, there was, as well as the sort of seasonal fishing at Caithness, people started going to the farms and the lowlands for seasonal work, and women started to go to the East Coast as well to work. And the 1861 census, again, you'll see the population is really low, really young, 70% of the population under 30. And interestingly, this is the decade where, for the first time since the records began, we start to see rent increases. So there was a couple of rent increases, and when you look at the percentages, they were quite substantial. Almost 2% and almost 7% increase within a decade. That's quite a substantial, you know, for, and we'll see sort of later, they were already paying too much for the rent. So to add even more of a burden was challenging, to say the least. Number of houses since the 1851 census gone up by 9, although the number of crofts remained the same. And the main occupations, not surprisingly, crofting and fishing, and although there was a couple of weavers and a couple of cowherds and a minister. Population again, I think is an interesting comparison when you compare it against the population of Lewis, increased by just under 7% between 1851-61, but the population of Vatisker increased by 22%. So again, the population of the village is far sort of outstripping the sort of general population increase. And time again, you'll see, quite a number of tragedies at sea for local fishermen. And 31st of May 1862 was one of those when 6 men from Col lost their lives. I've included the next bit because for me it was interesting, because you always hear about people emigrating to Canada and other places, and the grass is always greener on the other side. This was a letter that was posted in the Scotsman in 1864, and seems to be saying actually it's not always greener on the other side. The people who emigrated from Lewis the previous year are living on charity, and they've got no means of subsistence. So in a lot of ways, things weren't perhaps even worse when they emigrated. So I just thought that was an interesting viewpoint from a different sort of angle. In 1865, there was some documentation that, and again, this really shows the progress made over that period. So at this stage, there was 2017 in back, and most adults could read Gaelic. So I mean, what a transformation and quite a small number of years, really. So it kind of shows where education was going. And the Commissioner's report in 1867, there was 2 schools, one the Gaelic school in Vatisker and the Free Church school at Back. So you can see great strides coming along in terms of education. I know this is a bit morbid in terms of looking at causes of death, but again, it's for me it's interesting to see the sort of the commonality across the decades. This was a particularly this was one of the sort of I guess emotional moments of the project, I guess. So if you look at measles, there was an epidemic of measles in 1862 in the district, and I remember I was looking through the death records for Stornoway Parish and flipping the pages, and seeing page after page of children dying of measles, and actually dreading turning the next page just in case there was any more. So it really was quite a one of those moments when you're doing research that it's very kind of emotional, even though the people weren't related to you or anything like that. It's a human thing. And I think the most striking thing about this decade is the top 2 are child's diseases. If you look at the average age, it's 2. The average age is 2 and 5 for measles. So again, quite a kind of emotional picture there. Again, another fishing accident, 1868 off Vatisker Point. One of many, and this time the fishermen were from Tong. I've kind of started to talk about migration there, and it's quite a complex subject. Excuse me. And sort of 1861, 1871 was kind of the first time that we could really do a proper comparison because of when the records started to be available. But essentially, if you take the number of births in Vatisker, the number of deaths in Vatisker, the difference is what you would expect the population to increase or decrease by. So for that particular decade, you would expect the population to increase by 61. There's 61 more births than there is deaths, but in fact the census shows it increased by 60. So the obvious assumption, which I've still to validate to be honest, is that there was migration. One person, net on average, one person left the village. This is a bit of a more complex picture, and it's maybe a complex description as well. What I've done here is, if you look at the 1861 column at the very top, this is the age range, 0 to 9, and at that point in time there was 95 people in that age range. And as things sort of progress, as you move on to the next census, you would expect the people in that age range to be in the next age range in the next census, but in fact you'll see a difference there. So we started off with 95 people, and by the time it came to 1871, in that generation there was 82 people in the village. So you would think actually that might be a simple mathematical calculation, 95 minus 82, so there was 13 people left the village, but in fact it's not really that straightforward. And I just wanted to highlight some of the things that could happen here, some of the things that have happened with that particular group of people. So there were 16 people who were on the 1871 census that were not on the 1861 census, and 8 of those were servants and labourers, so pretty transient population. They would move around, so they would be there for one census and they'd be somewhere else for the next census. So again, the only way you can really get to the bottom of this is if you understand every single individual and where they went and where they ended up. There were 6 people who should have been in that age range, but because of what we were talking about earlier, that people didn't know what age they were, or they weren't really bothered about what was recorded, they were effectively in the wrong age range in the next census. And there was one person there, Mary McRae of 46, Vatisker. She was shown as 10 in the 1871 census, but she wasn't even born at the time of the 1861 census, so she could not have been 10. So there's all these kind of anomalies. It just makes it really complicated. There were 7 people died before the 1871 census. There was a couple of people went to Canada, and there was 15 that I couldn't find out where they went. I'm still to get to the bottom of that. But this was just really to demonstrate that it's not just a simple calculation, that there is complications, and so you will see that I managed to get back to 95 miraculously. But it's just to show that there is some complications. So the same sort of group of people, if we fast forward to 1911, I think that gives us a sort of better picture of where people ended up. So you'll see there that actually almost 60% either remained in Vatisker or were deceased at that point. So there is a lot of theory around emigration, and in fact for this particular set of people there was only 9 of the original 95 who actually left the island. That's a very specific group of people, and I need to sort of analyse the other generations, but it was just it was just really to show you that for that particular group, emigration abroad wasn't perhaps as prevalent as maybe folk would have thought. My usual kind of comparisons, 1871 to 1861 census. There was one more croft added in 1871 and 4 in 1876, so took the number to 51. And there was 59 houses at that point. So again, more houses than crofts, so there was more than one house on a number of crofts, or there were houses in the sort of common land. And you can see the trend here in terms of population. Again, Vatisker is increasing population at a much higher rate than Lewis overall. So 376 at that point, and 95% of those were born in Stornoway. Stornoway parish as opposed to the town. And another interesting point about this one is the top occupations. The first one is scholar, and again, for me that shows the improvements in education, because it wasn't even quoted in previous censuses. So fishermen and agricultural labourer were the next two. 1872, the Education Act made education compulsory, and whilst I think generally people felt education was a good thing, in some ways people didn't like it, because some of the children were needed to do craft work, and they also felt that education was geared towards educating people away from the islands, and they felt that the kids are going to school, they will tend more to sort of leave and go elsewhere, so they would lose them, kind of thing. So truancy became a big issue, and the sort of, I guess, the craft work, the epidemics and weather, and I think to a lesser extent clothing and footwear seem to be the sort of issues around that time. And 1873 there was an announcement that there would be 24 new schools in Lewis, and one of those was to be at Back, for the people of Back, Vatisker and Col. 1874 we start to see some of the sort of land demonstrations, if you like, so opposition to evictions in Bernera, and sort of angry demonstrations that actually were successful in the end, and I think that gave a big psychological boost to the Crofton community. The evictions were cancelled, and basically a big victory against the landlord. 1874, we've already mentioned, the RNR was launched in Stornoway, and there was a report in the Oban Times in 1874 that suggested the crofters were existing in a state of slavery, virtual slavery, which I think maybe a wee bit of exaggeration, but I think it kind of sort of underlines the sort of power of the landlord again. Exciting times, 1874, November, the post office was established at Back, and 1877 the new school was completed. And an interesting story from my own family perspective, when the new school was completed, the old school was put up for sale, and a chap called Duncan Mackay, previously of 21 Vatisker, bought it, and they called it Ray Cottage, which was the area that the family came from, and he was the brother of my third great-grandfather. 1878, James Matheson died, and in November that year, the first Back public school was opened. Back to deaths, and you can see that the average age over that period, 1870s, increased to 55, and I think that was just a reflection of the community was getting a bit older at that point, and the usual kind of suspects, I guess, up there in terms of the sort of major causes, croup and whooping cough, but you can start seeing old age coming in as a sort of cause of death, which again kind of underlines that the community is ageing. There was one addition which I've put a question mark because I think there's possibly a bit of investigation to be done here, but according to the valuation rolls, that was 1886 to 1887, and that was the addition of the smithy. And big news, 1888, 89, when the Crofters Act came into passing, the reduction in rents was 26% across the village. So that's an indication of how much more the Crofters were paying for their crofts than really they should have been, and that was for decades that they were paying far too much. Interestingly, the period 1881 to 1871, I think, is the first decade where the population of the village is less changed than the population of Lewis as a whole. One thing to point out about 1881 is there's a page missing in the census records in a Register House. So the actual population you'll see there, it might be confusing if you've read it. The actual population is 371, but I've added 25 for the page that's missing, because there's normally 25 entries on each page. So that's why I've asterisked it there. But if that is the case, then these numbers are correct. Again, I suppose bad weather was kind of predominant in the early 1880s. Measles epidemic again, and in 1883 what became known as the Napier Commission was commenced, and what was I going to say about that? So I thought it was just an interesting thing in Aberdeen Weekly Journal of December 1884. They took an example from Vatisker, Norman MacLeod, and I think it was just given a bit of an indication of there was 11 people living in that particular household at that particular time. But I've purely mentioned it because Vatisker's mentioned. 1885, the first general election where a lot of crofters were able to vote, and there were candidates supported by the Land League, and one of them, Dr. Roderick MacDonald, was elected. And again, you can see the progress in terms of the crofters. They were starting to be heard, basically, which obviously improved over time. So the Crofter Act became law 1886, and that gave security of tenure and fairly assessed rents, and we've already seen the impact of that. Many think it sort of failed to address the problem of the cotters, or the sort of people who didn't have sort of land of their own. And again, a bit of unrest in terms of the land question around Park, 1887, and I think probably surprisingly they were found not guilty, which again gave a bit of a boost to the sort of crofter population. More measles in 1887, and this time there were, this was mentioned actually in the House of Commons, that there were 18 deaths in Stornoway Parish, and 10 of those were in Vatisker in 1887. And I thought, interestingly, there was 2 sets of siblings who sadly lost their life in that year, at 4 Vatisker, Anne and Donaldina Stewart, and at 10 Vatisker, Catherine and Margaret McRae. So again, there was a bit of an inquest into the measles epidemic, and also the general sort of condition on the island, and again the solution was emigration. It just seemed to be the standard back then. That was the solution. I'm going to share just something from the 4th of February 1888, and again this was one of those sort of emotional moments in the National Archives, when I was sort of presented with this letter that was almost 130 years old. And, you know, you're holding the actual letter in your hand, and when you sort of read through it, the key bits in red there, really, and the bit that really got me was, I've taken my mind away from this place where people are at the point of starvation. I thought it was quite upsetting, to be honest. This chap was John MacLeod of 17 Vatisker. Sadly, he did apply as part of one of the emigration schemes, and he was accepted. But his application was marked that his wife was not willing, so they didn't go to Canada. And interestingly, he actually lost his son and his daughter and his wife within a couple of years, and I don't think he ever made it to Canada. He died in Vatisker, I think 1909. So it was, I guess, sort of quite emotional reading that, and being able to sort of follow through on that and see what actually happened was quite fulfilling, really. And then there was 3 Vatisker families that went as part of that scheme, and they were 3 of the 18, and again 1888 the telegraph arrived at Back. Another interesting story about Duncan Mackay, when the plans were drawn up for the new church, 1890, he was asked to he was a joiner, and he was asked to use red pine wood, and he used it only for part of the church, and it resulted in a big discussion, shall we say, with the minister, and he left the congregation. So this chap was a relation of mine. I think, you know, we've kind of seen the patterns here in terms of health in the village. Measles again, kind of top of the list in that decade, and the average age seems to have dramatically decreased again. I'm not really sure why. And looking at the migration picture, or what I think is a migration. This is over a 20-year period this time, but you can see there it looks like there's a sort of outflow of 71 at that point. This is basically 1891 whooping cough epidemic, and the 1891 census. There was further reduction in rents as a result of the Crofters Act in 1892-93, and as you can see, the population continuing to increase. Top occupation is not really changing. There were a few sort of sea tragedies sort of later in the decade, and Colonel Duncan Matheson took over as landlord, and that's kind of, I think, just kind of saying the same. I suppose the addition there is flu during that decade. This is quite interesting because actually that looks like there's an inflow of people between 1891 and 1901. So by the births and deaths, you'd expect a net impact of 45, and there was actually 98 more people. I need to probably have a further look at that, but I think it's an interesting, when you see the trend previously, that seems a bit strange. But it could be, as I say, it could be people just sort of working in a different place for where they live, kind of thing, so need to have a proper look at that. Another massive increase in population, 1901, and I think you can see most people there speaking both, or, well, not most people, but well, yeah, most people speaking Gaelic, and about half speaking English. Getting there, 1902 the Annex of School was built, and there was some movement in terms of sort of the Secretary of State, so the government starting to get more involved in things and working, I was going to say working with the landlord, but I think trying to drive the landlord to make improvements. More measles, beginning of the 1900s, and the Congested District Board basically saying there isn't enough land to support the current population on the island. In 1907, Hector Comann retired as minister after 26 years. And the old age pension started in 1908. More measles, 1908, 1909, and again government pressing for more action about the overcrowding in the townships. This is the final page, you'll be glad to know. But again, it's an interesting stat there that for the first time you can see a minus 20% in terms of the population of the village. So the first time really there's been a big reduction. And if you sort of look at the sort of net migration figure, it's minus 171. So again, there seems to be in that decade a lot of people leaving the village. Now, I suppose one sort of health warning in that is it could be people migrating for work temporarily again. So, you know, I'm not going to make any assumptions until I've actually finalised it. So that kind of gives just a bit of a run through of some of the stuff I've been looking at. It'll it'll be more interesting once I've actually completed the analysis, I think. But it was just to give you an idea of, and hopefully giving you a bit of an insight into some of the official sort of documents. And I guess that's my one plea is, a lot of what I'm doing is based on official documents. Who knows if they're right, to be honest. I personally would love to bring this stuff to life, and I think we can only do that through bringing everybody's stories to life. And my aunt last week put a story together about my grandfather, which you know, I'll let people read it if they want to, but it kind of just brings a kind of human aspect to this. I'm sure a lot of you may be thinking a lot of that stuff was quite dry, because it is, you know, it's official stats and analysis, and I really want to kind of humanise it a bit. And I think, I'm hoping that you guys can help me with that, by, you know, writing some tributes to your own ancestors, along very similar lines or along whatever lines you would like to do. One thing that I should have pointed out earlier is when I was talking about why I'm doing this stuff, I'm not doing this for any personal financial gain. I'm not making any money at all. All of my work, when it's completed, will be donated to the Historical Society. This is, I guess, a kind of labour of love, if you like. I want it to be as good as it can be, and I want it to be personal, and I want to record about the people, not just about the stats. So that is it, really. So last point, if you do want to contribute, you can see it on Facebook, Memories of Vatisker. You can email me, you can call me. You know, please do it. I would be really interested to know your stories. I know when I was up in the summer, Anne came along and was very interested and gave us some information and showed me some documents about her grandfather, which was really interesting, and really helps us to start to understand the people that sort of shaped, I guess, who we are today. And that's it, really. So thank you very much for listening, and hopefully you can have a wee chat when we're having a cup of tea. Yeah?
Thank you. Perhaps when we're having a cup of tea, you could go back to the slide that your great aunt was it wrote about your grandfather, and then maybe later put your own details up as well, so that anyone else feels they have anything to contribute to the Vatisker story, and have Ian, you know, his details are up there, and this might give you an idea of personalising your own family histories. Alexina, would you like to say a few words about you?
Well, you will all agree with me that that was a very interesting talk. I learned an awful lot about that. And what I found interesting really was the number of people, of children who died with measles.
Yeah.
My grandfather lost 3 young children, 2 boys and a girl, I think, although he stayed in Bath at the time. And they all died of measles. And the other thing I found interesting was that there were so many scholars. I don't know why I found this interesting. Yeah. There were so many scholars in Vatisker. So thank you very much, Ian, and thank you in the usual way.
Thank Thank you. And before we have a cup of tea and a blather, and please feel free to speak to Ian. Our next meeting is going to be on the 22nd of this month, which is 2 weeks tonight, when the Back, compiled by Ian Murray from Ryanbark, is going to be launched in the church hall. I'll say no more about it, but please come and support that occasion. Ian has done an amazing amount of research on the heroes of the area from the First and Second World War, and also the drownings, which Ian mentioned tonight. There's also Bardock. Read all about it when you see the book. Also, our calendar is now on sale. £8, excellent value, beautiful illustrations and historical text as well. Those of you who got it last year, it's in the same format. Anything else I forgot? No? Okay, Combati's coffee is there.